Sugar is the ultimate antioxidant. Apparently. Lose weight, eating sugar obesity myth exposed by Christopher Walker, CEO of Umzu. I was seeing these products years ago, so he's still kicking. Good, great. Good for him. It's just unfortunate that these people will make a living. We're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, basically just spewing absolute garbage. Absolute erroneous garbage, okay? And people feed into it, they really do. Because they have no other choice. They have to look outward for the truth. And they think that these people are telling them the truth. And that's why I'm here, is to teach you guys, really, how to interpret science. What science can and can't say. That's what this is all about. So, if you couldn't tell by this video already, we're going to be reacting to this video 13 minutes and 13 seconds. I don't know how long we're going to get into this. It's not going to be the full thing, probably. So we're going to react to this. We're going to put Chris right where he's wrong, which is absolutely everywhere, frankly. I've seen his content enough in advertisements. Apparently, Cole Robinson is the one that is sending people to this video. Cole Robinson. I haven't covered that yet, but wow. There's only so much I can get to at once. That's the unfortunate truth. So anyway, with that being said, we're going to jump directly into this and waste no further time. Let's learn how sugar is the ultimate antioxidant. Anyway, getting into position here, and let's do it.
Sugar is the ultimate antioxidant.
No, it isn't. But let's hear your inane reasoning behind this.
Claim, right? Before people get their panties in a bunch, let me explain something to you. When I say sugar, I'm referring to glucose and fructose. I'm not referring to or advocating donuts, cakes, and all.
Oh my God, Chris. Oh my Are you serious? What do cakes and donuts break down to in the stomach, Chris? Glucose and fructose? Wow, we're starting off real strong. This is the quality? I thought we were going to get into some obfuscation, some pseudo-sophistication. No, this is Paul Saladino University. Paul Saladino told me that glucose and fructose from natural foods are totally fine. But if you get them from another food, they're magically different. To steelman the argument, as I always do on this channel, it is true that cake and donuts have other things in them. The argument could be, well, it's better than having all of those other things, but it doesn't exonerate the sugar, Chris. Do we need to get into basic physiology for you, Sunshine?
Manner of foodstuffs people commonly associate with the word sugar. People
associate, first of all, and second of all, we associate it with sugar, rightfully so, because it's one of the major constituents of the foods, Chris.
People rarely ever consume sugar in its pure form.
Well, first of all, that's arguable, okay? Bread, for example, is almost nothing but sugar, Chris. But second of all, so what?
The last time you ate a spoonful of raw coconut or maple sugar? Real honey?
Never, actually. In fact, no, that's not true. I did that one time, and it was because I was effectively starving, because I wasn't able to eat anything years ago, whenever I was dealing with my condition. There you go. And it wasn't even a full spoonful. Anyway, Chris, are you advocating for us to do this? Spoonfuls of sugar? Are you out of your mind? Do you know how physiology works, Chris?
Or royal jelly. For many of you, probably...
Well, first of all, he said honey. Let me just touch on that. Honey is even worse because it's got more fructose in it. And before people say, oh, but the enzymes in honey. People really need to look into the enzymes in honey. Because what they'll find is that all of the enzymes in honey are only involved, I kid you not, they are only involved, every single one, in breaking down the sugar in the honey. So it makes it, if anything, it makes it even more readily digested. Wow! And then one of the subsequent products of the enzymatic action, I think, is H2O2, so peroxide, which is where it gets its antimicrobial properties. Should you be consuming H2O2? Let me just ask you that question. Should you be consuming hydrogen peroxide? Should you be microdosing peroxide? Yeah, I don't really think so. Anyway, let's continue. We'll get into the physiology whenever he starts to pretend like he knows it.
Everyone loves to demonize sugar as the cause of obesity, yet when you analyze both the research and the actual biochemistry...
Okay, so already a lot of words here. Let's get into it. Everyone wants to demonize. No, not demonize. We rightfully point blame at something for causing something physiologically via causal mechanisms, okay? Second of all, the cause of obesity. It's not necessarily sugar, okay? What it is insulin. Okay? Insulin not itself, because insulin has a role to play or else the body wouldn't produce it. The genes are not at fault for basically anything, actually, unless you have problems with the genes, and then it's still not the genes' fault. They're still doing what they're supposed to do, but there was something that went wrong in reproduction or something like that. Anyway, but higher levels of insulin and higher frequency of insulin spiking, eventually leading to a hypertrophy of fat cells, inflammation, not insulin itself, but the things that are spiking insulin, like, I don't know, glucose, and fructose indirectly to some extent, not directly. We all know that fructose is not directly insulinogenic, leading to eventually a systemic insulin resistant scenario and then diabetes. Insulin is the prototypical anabolic hormone. It raises the Vmax and the Km values of enzymes responsible for fatty acid synthesis, triglyceride synthesis, most importantly, actually. This is basic physiology. Do you understand fatty acid synthesis? What is the cause of fatty acid synthesis? And what hormones upregulate that process and initiate that process? Chris, do you understand subsequent triglyceride synthesis? Do you understand that chemical pathway? Do you understand this shit? Because I'm thinking no, you don't, okay? Now, the next thing that he said, when you really analyze the research, do you know how to analyze research? Do you know what research is? Do you know how to read a science paper, Chris? Do you know what can and cannot be informed upon with inferential statistics? Because I don't think so. But unfortunately, you've built your entire brand on misleading people into what the science purportedly, no scare quotes, which isn't anything, but really indicates is what we should say. Good Chris. Good Let's look at the research, Chris.
The human body, you start to see a very...
All right, decreasing sugar consumption failed to reduce obesity. Okay, how long did the study go on for? What was the demographic of people? What was the sample size? Okay, what were the p-values? All right, was there a control group? What type of study was this in the first place? Randomized control trial? Prospective cohort study? Let's look at this. The Australian Paradox 2011. Alan W. Barclay and Jenny Brand Miller. Let's copy that. Let's analyze the paper. Let's go ahead and do that. Since you want to flash a paper up on the screen, and instead you're actually not flashing the paper up on the screen, you're flashing graphs up on the screen, and I love looking at graphs. So let's get into this. All right, abstract. Ecological research from the USA has demonstrated a positive relationship between sugars consumption, okay, interesting. What types of sugars? So again, pen, notes. What was strength of the association? What sugars? From where? What sources? Straight sugar? However, the relationship in other nations is not well described, okay? The aim of this study was to analyze the trends, so they're analyzing associations, in obesity and sugar consumption in Australia over the past 30 years, prospective cohort study. That's the study, where you compare two populations, sometimes just one. This looks sort of like one, but you're comparing two cohorts. So one will be Australia and comparing it to the United States. That's basically what they're doing here. At least that's what I can infer from this. And you're looking at associations. What are those associations based on? Respondent data, where people can lie and forget, and also what was characterized as sugar consumption and what was not characterized as sugar consumption. What else were these people doing? Healthy user bias and unhealthy user bias. What were the absolute outcomes of these studies, results? What was the age demographic? 30 years. I mean, wow, 30 years. Do your habits never change in 30 years? I can tell you right now, my habits change every week. Okay, maybe an exaggeration, but that's not the point. Okay, so another bullshit study already. But let's just continue just for fun. I'm making a video, so, in my own time, I would just brush this off. I really would. But today, we're going through it together. Let's have some fun. Sugar consumption in Australia over the past 30 years, and to compare and contrast obesity trends and sugar consumption patterns in Australia with the UK and the USA. So that's what I mean. So in this case, it's 3 cohorts, basically. Do people in the USA, the UK, and Australia live the same ways? Very interesting. Data on consumption of sugar in Australia, the UK, and the USA were obtained from the Food and Agricultural Organization for the years 1980 to 2003. Yeah, there definitely won't be any noise around this signal. Great. The prevalence of obesity has increased threefold in Australians since 1980. Yeah. In Australia, the UK, and the USA, per capita consumption of refined sucrose, decreased by 23%, 10%, and 20% respectively from 1980 to 2003. I'd love to see the absolute values for those as well, because that's important. Percentages, ratios, fractions, those are all relative outcomes. Except fractions would be better because it's in relation to a value. It would actually be you see the absolute. values right there. But anyway, when all sources of nutritive sweeteners, including high fructose corn syrups, were considered, per capita consumption decreased in Australia 16%, and the UK around 5%, but increase in the USA plus 23%. Fantastic. So once again, what was the noise around this signal? 23 plus or minus what? Minus 5 plus or minus what? Minus 16 plus or minus what? This is extremely important to assess here. And how was this assessed? How can you tell that sugar consumption decreased or increased at all? Is it based on respondent data? Because immediately it doesn't matter at that point. Sorry. In Australia, there was a reduction in sales of nutritively sweetened beverages by 64 million liters from 2002 to 2006, and reduction in percentage of children consuming sugar-sweetened beverages between 1995 and 2007. So here's, by the way, a note that I want to add here. I keep saying respondent data. If the data was aggregated from Food and Agricultural Organization for the years 1980 to 2003, they might just be looking at sales instead, which would make it more accurate, to be fair. The findings confirm an Australian paradox, a substantial decline in refined sugars intake over the same time frame that obesity has increased. So what? Does that mean sugar is completely exonerated from contributing to the obesity epidemic? No. The point still stands that insulin is the primary anabolic hormone. What other behaviors changed? What other things were they starting to do and starting to not do as well? How have behaviors changed? You're drawing a causal inference, okay, based on studies that fail to control for confounding variables and spurious variables. A substantial decline in refined sugars intake over the same time frame that obesity has increased. The implication is that efforts to reduce sugar intake may reduce consumption but may not reduce the prevalence of obesity. Okay, may, see those words may there? And may not? Yeah, exactly. Introduction, the prevalent blah, blah, blah. I don't care. 2, methods. A systematic literature review was undertaken to obtain sources of Australian sugar intake data. Keywords used in the search include sugar, sucrose, dietary carbohydrate consumption, intake, sugar-sweetened beverages, sweeteners, refined sugar, obesity, adiposity, body weight, body mass index with Australia. The term blood glucose was excluded in the START strategy. Blah, 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 blah. Let's look at these graphs here. Let's just look at the graphs. Adults, Australia, 1980 to 2007 to 2008. Percentage of what? Prevalence of obesity in percentage, okay? In Australian adults, Australian children, adults in the United Kingdom, children in the United Kingdom, yeah, blah, 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 okay. Okay, so it's gone up, sure. United Kingdom, gone up. United States of America, gone up. And it's gone up in all of these other groups as well. Okay, so we understand that. Intake of added sugars, right? So we're seeing a sort of trend here, great. And we're seeing more trends. In fact, in the United States, you're seeing it go upwards. And in Australia, you're seeing it go down, at least in some of these groups. Total nutritive sweeteners, refined sucrose, but then other sweeteners like that. Sure, fine. Yep. Okay. So what? Total sugars added and naturally occurring, sugary products, confectionery, non-alcoholic beverages. Yes, blah, 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 blah. So looking at all these graphs, we understand, okay, there's an association between a decrease in total sugar consumption and an actual increase in obesity in 3 major Western countries. And we already covered that that doesn't mean that sugar is completely exonerated, okay? It doesn't mean that. I'm sorry, it does not mean that. Let's say theoretically that something was introduced into the environment that caused lung cancer. We knew that it caused lung cancer, okay? And let's say that over the course of 30 years, smoking prevalence went down. We were somehow able to measure that. But lung cancer rates continued to climb. Does that mean that smoking doesn't contribute to lung cancer? Or does that mean that there might be other factors at play? Wow. So is smoking exonerated? Keep smoking those cigarettes. No. This is a piss poor study, Chris. It really is. See, this is what I mean. Do you know how to analyze science? Do you really know how to analyze science? Or are you just pretending to? You're putting a bunch of graphs up here, which first of all, you can't even make out on the screen.
Picture unfold with some extremely convincing evidence to the contrary.
Convincing is a value judgment statement, and it's your opinion, Chris. It's not convincing to anyone with a brain.
In today's video, I'm going to explore the science of sugar.
Are you going to explore it? First of all, if you're going to explore it, let's make sure that you do it responsibly. I'll be here to make sure of that. But second of all, do you mean explore it, or have you already looked at it and you're just going to give your spin on it?
This is an appropriate topic, especially since we've been digging into the
Sugar 101. Thermodynamics. Hold on a minute. What?
This is an appropriate topic, especially since we've been digging into the thermo diet and looking deeply at the flaws in the keto diet, and therefore
the flaws in the keto diet. Oh, I'd love to watch that. I'd love to criticize that, Chris, because I'm sure there's plenty there.
Is between a glucose metabolism and a fatty acid metabolism.
Ketones are not the body's preferred fuel source. Well, guess what, Chris? There is no such thing as a preferred fuel source by the body, because prefer or preference refers to perception, which the body doesn't have because it doesn't have a consciousness. Everything in the body is chemistry, okay? So don't say preferred. Ketones are used when the concentration of ketones outweighs the chemical pressure of glucose and fatty acids, and when the hormonal signaling, particularly the I to G ratio, is predisposed towards allowing ketones to be used primarily and produced in the first place in high enough concentrations to outweigh said chemical pressures. Chris, get the out of here.
So far we've seen how preferable and efficient glucose metabolism is for hormone.
No, absolutely false, because the body doesn't prefer anything. The body will use glucose for ATP production aerobically, whenever the chemical pressures are propitious towards allowing that to happen. That's how things work. What we do know, though, Chris, is that exogenous glucose is contraindicated for human consumption. Contraindicated, by the way, Chris, and also anyone else watching. My book. Buy now. Second edition, out now. Links to those in the description below. Paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. We're working on the ebook still. Amazon is not really fun to work with. I'm trying to get it on other platforms now. It will not be on Amazon. It will not be. So just throwing that out there. It will be on other platforms soon to come. So anyway, Chris, you'd learn something if you actually read my book. Objectively, of course, okay? But it's contraindicated for human consumption because it's not required for human consumption, first of all, and also above a certain physiological concentration within the bloodstream that is most conducively achieved by consuming the damn thing, is toxic, glycation, and subsequent formation of AGEs. What is diabetes, Chris? Is it chronically elevated blood glucose and nothing else, explicitly and exclusively defined and measured as such? Why is diabetes deadly? It's because of glucose, Chris. We're done.
Health and a healthy metabolism.
Well, there's really not any such thing as a healthy or unhealthy metabolism, if you really think about it. There's just external factors that could be influencing the way that your metabolism runs, and the metabolism is still operating exactly how it ought to be given the circumstances. So,
propaganda around the keto diet involves
the propaganda around the keto diet. The keto diet. First of all, define the keto diet, because there's no such thing as the keto diet. Keto is an umbrella term for many different diets. Okay, Chris? Many different diets, one of which is carnivore, our species-appropriate, species-specific diet. And also, not to mention, that there is not just one carnivore diet. There are many different variations, and not only are there many different variations, there's also many different ways in which you can consume the diet. There are also many different ways in which you can consume each variation. 1 meal a day, multiple meals a day, protein to fat ratio. Okay? So you're lumping everything into one basket, so that's great. That's always a great thing to do. Give me a break. We have one diet for our speciation, just like every single animal on this planet, with very minimal variation around what that diet is, that being a species-appropriate, species-specific diet, once again, consisting of the flesh and the associated fat of large ruminant animals with added fat in the forms of butter, tallow, lard, suet, and ghee added to taste, with added salt to taste as well, and water. Eating when hungry, stopping when full, which usually causes people to trend towards eating once a day, eating a sufficient amount of protein for your physiological needs in one bolus to stimulate sufficient insulin for sufficient anabolic activity, and transitioning to that diet appropriately, prudently, over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, with each week removing the amount of contraindicated plant material in about 1/6 or 1/8 of an amount that it currently exists in, and commensurately raising your consumption of animal products. Again, emphasizing red ruminant meat. Dairy, I have a video about that. I'll link it in the top right corner of the screen. I'm not really a fan of dairy. I think it could be used as a tool, but I do not think that it is exactly the most indicated. I know I get flack for that, but Ken Berry and I share the same sentiment.
Of sugar and a glucose metabolism, even though this is biochemically unsound.
Oh, really? So you want to talk about biochemistry? These people want to talk about frankly, Chris, you're offensive as and we're barely a minute into the video. Let's see how much he knows about biochemistry, folks. This will be fun.
Fatty acid ketone metabolism has far more negative consequences on the human body due to this.
No, it doesn't. Ketosis, decreased thyroid function, increased oxidative stress, increased cortisol. Wow. Wow, guys. I've covered all of these things on my channel. And in my book, Chris, I'm telling you, really telling you, you'd benefit from this. You really would. Links to the description in the below. Links to description in the below. Good. Sorry, it's probably the ketones in my brain. It's probably the ketones in my brain and the fatty acids that I'm oxidizing. Off. Anyway, decreased thyroid function, we've covered that. Okay, Chris, thyroid function, in order to be optimal and adequate, requires sufficient insulin. What stimulates insulin, Chris? Glucose, yes, correct. What else does? Is it protein? The answer is yes. Okay. Increased oxidative stress. Okay. Define oxidative stress. How was that defined? And how was that measured? Well, operational definition matters and the measurement matters. Also, it begs the question as to whether the slight increase in oxidative stress that may have been seen is actually a problem that is posed to the body when removing all of the other things that decrease oxidative stress. I don't know, glycation damage from consuming sugar. Okay? Also, we have this ability to create antioxidants in our body endogenously, and we also have the ability to ground electrically to the earth. Okay? So anyway, increased cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone involved in the production of 3 primary gluconeogenic enzymes that regulate the gluconeogenic pathway. PepsiK, phosphoenol pyruvate carboxykinase, fructose 1,6-bisphosphatase, I believe, and pyruvate carboxylase, I think. Look, I'm rusty, but they're involved in the production of them. And so usually what you'll see is that when people adopt a ketogenic diet, usually inappropriately transitioning, so doing it overnight, first of all, you'll see in studies that it suggests that there's an increase in cortisol. But first of all, cortisol is not inherently a distressing hormone. It will always be associated with distress because of its involvement in the production of glucose, okay? Which happens when you are stressed out and use your muscles a lot because you're tensed up. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every instance of an elevation in cortisol above normative values of the population is representative of distress occurring in the body, Chris. But putting that aside, it's also acute because once the enzymes are produced for gluconeogenic activity, because you're not consuming glucose, cortisol's pressure to be elevated decreases, Chris. What the is that? These are like the most hackneyed arguments, the most trite, banal arguments against ketosis. Give me a break, Chris. This is horrible.
Hormonal shift required for it. Now it's time to bust some myths about sugar that you might still be clinging to.
It is time to bust some myths. It really is about sugar. It really is.
The hearsay and mass media's propaganda.
Mass media's propaganda, because mass media wants you off sugar. Wow, wow, Chris. And frankly, this guy sounds like he is extremely lethargic, very lethargic sounding. I'm sorry. I really am, except I'm really not, because this is offensive. This content, this guy's making money. Great. You got a great marketing team, man, and video production team, because he's making lots of money, I can tell. And it's for saying a bunch of bullshit, okay? We need to support channels that actually know what the they're talking about. Anyway, let's continue here.
Relentless demonization of sugar.
Relentless demonization. So emotional language, great, cool. I'm just going to overlook that and not overlooking it. I'm calling it out, but still.
Again, so first off, sugar does not equal baked goods. It does not equal candy bars.
Baked goods and candy bars have sugar in them, Chris. They have other things as well, like plants, also contraindicated for human consumption. Read my book to find out, Chris. Plant toxins, fiber, an anti-nutrient, and arguably a plant toxin in and of itself, okay? It doesn't mean that since there's other things in there that may very well pose risks to one's health, that the sugar is exculpated, okay?
Drinks and anything else people commonly associate it with. It's not the same thing. All these foods...
Well, the molecules in the goods that you're talking about, goods, are the exact same as if you isolated them from the foods. Foods. Quotes. Okay? I hate my addictive personality, by the way, because what's on the screen actually looks good. But fortunately, I actually have some self-control, some restraint. You won't catch me drooling here.
They're nothing more than nutrient-void garbage food that should be consumed sparingly, if at all.
Yes. And it's also laden with a bunch of things that you shouldn't be eating. It's not just lacking in things, it's replete and teeming with things that you shouldn't be consuming, Chris. Like sugar!
This is the real crime in implicating sugar as something that's bad for the body because...
No, that is not the real crime, Chris. I'm not saying that having a spoonful of honey every day is the same thing as eating a bunch of donuts every day. Obviously have a spoonful of honey. However, the difference between honey and a donut with regard to the main issues between both of those foods is negligible. Because it's the sugar that is the main issue. With a donut, you have added seed oils, usually, and gluten. Those things are also bad, okay? I understand, but this doesn't mean that sugar is exonerated. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to burst your bubble here.
Baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. People, by association, demonize fruit, honey, royal jelly, and
Okay, once again with the whole demonize. We're not demonizing these things for existing, okay? They exist, and they should exist. Well, the man-made fruit here may be posing more of an issue than a good, okay? Because the fruit you see here on the screen, most of that, in terms of just the fruits themselves, did not exist thousands of years ago, and the ones in this picture that may have did not exist at the size that they do in this picture. They also did not exist year-round. It was seasonal, okay? Human intervention is what caused them to be so rich in sugar and bereft of fiber, which is arguably a good thing, but it makes something else worse, which is the spike in sugar. Fiber will at least blunt a glucose spike, which is something you should avoid, okay? Honey, we even more seldom encountered honey, okay? And actually consumed it, okay, Chris? It's full of f***ing sugar. It is still a problem, even if it has more nutrition in them, okay? That's not how logic works, Chris.
just simple raw cane sugar with zero real evidence for its negative effects in the
No, oh my God, Chris, define evidence. Are you talking about human nutrition science, which isn't science at all, but theology, because science actually requires control between, two groups of people? So you would need genotypically and phenotypically identical subjects in order to even consider it science to begin with, or to even begin to try and consider it science? Because what we're talking about are hard sciences where you can make hard inferences, okay? What is obesity? It is an amount of fat on the body that is arguably indicated to have been stored because you're consuming things that are causing it to be stored, but it is being fat over an amount that is deemed to be appropriate and that can actually start to cause issues when it comes to joint functionality, mobility, insulin and glucose regulation, okay? Inflammation. That's obesity. What causes the storage of fat? It's not just insulin, but it's the primary hormone involved in that because it's the prototypical anabolic hormone. What stimulates insulin readily? The most readily stimulatory, if that's a word, insulinogenic. That's the word to use. Compound out of the three major macronutrients, or what are considered to be macronutrients, is glucose. Okay, so the consumption of glucose will raise insulin. What happens when insulin's raised? Biochemically, it increases the activity of enzymes responsible for synthesizing fat and also synthesizing triglycerides. Triglycerides are only formed when they are to be stored. They are not formed if they won't be stored. That's not how that works. No, triglycerides are stored in fat cells. That's the storage form of fats, okay? What is the exact required amount of carbohydrates in the human diet? 0. Above a certain physiological concentration within the bloodstream. What induces harm? Carbohydrates. So they're not required. Above a certain physiological concentration, they induce damage via glycation, fructose more than glucose, and they cause stimulations of insulin that is conducive to storing large amounts of fat. Since sugar is addictive, it will also cause you to overeat, in many cases, on other things that you ought to be consuming, leading to an even greater issue. You also have a Randall cycle situation that leads to insulin dysregulation or insulin signaling differences. There's another issue that happens when you eat a significant amount of both fats and carbohydrates together. Okay? All of these things are pointing in the direction of, hey, sugar is still a issue. But guess what? You can lower a threshold that you would have to attain to store onto fat with a bolus of glucose. So you could be inflamed all the time because you're consuming other things like seed oils and also being exposed to environmental toxins that would make it to where storing, let's say, a pound of fat in a month would only require you to eat 100 grams of carbs every day instead of 200, which could explain the differences in the association between lower sugar consumption and increased obesity. It may take less sugar if you're doing a lot of other things to make people fat. It doesn't change the physiology here. It doesn't. Sorry. Chris, let's get into physiology.
Effects of an otherwise solid, hormonally focused diet like we talk about on this channel and in my book.
Really? You talk about the Thor program. Give me a break.
Rarely do people fully understand what sugar is and how it acts in the body. And
oh, well, guess what? Here I am, someone that does understand it. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, lactose. Great. So you've got 2 monosaccharides and 2 disaccharides. Good. The reason I said that is because he wants to pretend like I don't know what I'm talking about with sugar. I'm just showing him that I do understand. Good. Cool.
Much it really contributes to obesity, inflammation, hormones, etc. And now
that A lot of that is up to subjective interpretation and opinion, because you would have to assess human nutrition science, which is ambiguous at best, if you're even to consider it science at all, which it f***ing isn't.
Moved over from blaming saturated fat for all of our health problems. We need a new thing to demonize and blame for our obesity and health problems.
Okay, Chris, you can be right on some things and wrong on others. Saturated fat is not a problem in the human diet. The problem is seed oils, environmental toxins, endocrine disruptors, all that stuff, and also f***ing sugar and plants, okay? Multifaceted issue here. Anyway, a quote from Chris Masterjohn, PhD. As the stance against saturated fat begins to soften, we need to exercise caution that we do not replace the demonization of saturated fat with the demonization of sugar. First of all, I've already talked about the words demonization, but even just giving some grace here, no, we don't need to replace it with caution at all, because the reasoning behind the demonization of sugar is completely different than the reasoning behind the demonization of saturated fat. The demonization of saturated fat was based on fraud. That's actually an extremely important point to make. It was based on fraud. It's just a fact at this point. Anyone that denies it is basically using the same logic that they would have to apply to deny that 2 + 2 = 4. It's right in front of your goddamn face. It was released in 2015. It was admitted to be the case. It was based on fraud. Okay? So there's a sign. Was the demonization of sugar based on fraud? Government business fraud? No, it wasn't. Or else all of the big f***ing businesses would be pushing this narrative, and they're f***ing not, Chris, even though you wanted to pretend like that was the case at the beginning of this video.
Sugar's the perfect target, and it certainly gets its share of a bad
It's the perfect target because of everything that I've laid out here.
rap already. But did you know that even though we try to blame sugar for everything and say that we are getting
No, we don't blame sugar for everything, Chris. False. And also, who's we?
and fatter due to increased sugar usage, the science actually shows that sugar consumption has
Science shows. Oh, great. Tell us all about what science can and can't show. The very things that I talk about, the very thing that I talk about on this channel. And once again, Chris, in my book, I should write an entire new book, a second book, all about that, actually. And I've had ideas to do that.
dropped during this period of time, that the obesity rates have dramatically risen.
Covered that.
One study calls this the Australian paradox, as during the time from
Right, we looked at that, didn't we? We covered that already, didn't we? Chris, we're done.
1980 to 2003, obesity rates tripled in the country, yet the intake of refined sugar dropped by 23%.
So what, Chris? There are other factors at play.
Heck, I certainly have given my fair share of negative press on sugar in the past years before I really looked at the data, because I was...
You don't know how to interpret data critically, Chris. You do not understand that. In fact, some of the criticisms that I just gave to your paper actually undermined my own position. Did you notice that? Whenever I was talking about what kinds of sugar, because if they were saying if there was an association between increased sugar intake and increased obesity, what kind of sugar? And where was the sugar sourced from and how was it tracked? Again, you want a channel full of objectivity, you'll find it here.
listening to other people that I shouldn't have been listening to. But over the years, as my...
Okay, sugar can actually improve insulin sensitivity and decrease oxidative stress. Insulin sensitivity is a construct, and therefore you have to assess and determine what was the criteria for insulin sensitivity, first of all, and decrease oxidative stress. Operationally define oxidative stress. Insulin decreases intracellular oxidative stress. First of all, as I'm putting this title in so that I can look at this paper, it says insulin, not sugar. What things stimulate insulin besides sugar? Chris? Insulin decreases intracellular... Hold on a minute. Full text servers, please. Insulin decreases intracellular... Oh my you have to pay for this shit. It's ridiculous. DOI, copy link. Give me a break. Insulin decreases intracellular oxidative stress in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus. Abstract. Patients affected by diabetes mellitus have oxidative stress with an impaired glutathione redox state. So, great. The objective of the study was to determine the influence of insulin on oxidative stress, defined as reduced intracellular GSH to GSH disulfide ratio and lipid peroxidation by plasma... Two experimental interventions were used. One, measurement of GSH to GSSG ratio after insulin incubation in erythrocytes from 10 type 2 diabetic patients. Are you f***ing kidding me? Insulin incubation, so taking insulin and glucose out of the fucking system in which they're found, in erythrocytes, so they're taking the erythrocytes out of the system in which they would be found as well, from 10, N of 10, type 2 diabetic patients. So also in a demographic of people with type 2 diabetes that also have different genes, genotypes and phenotypes. Congratulations, Chris. And 2, measurement of intra-erythrocytic GSH to GSSG ratio and plasma T-bars in 14 type 2 diabetic patients during an in vivo hyperinsulinemic condition obtained from a euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp study. 14 people. So this one is at least more substantial. Patients underwent oxidative stress as shown by the significant difference in intracellular ratio in diabetic patients as compared to controls, 13.56 plus or minus 3.84. Was that a standard deviation or a standard error? That matters. Also, during the clamp studies, GSH to GSSG ratio had already increased after 60 minutes and even more after 120 minutes. So let's look at these. Baseline, 15.04 plus or minus 4.19. Great. At 60 minutes, 19.74 plus or minus 6.33. So no, you do not have the signal to noise rate at 120 minutes, 25.33 plus or minus 11.15, p-value of 0.0001. So no, the signal to noise ratio on all of these, and I'd love to know if it's a standard deviation or a standard error, is so uninformative here to prevent you from making the conclusion that insulin in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus can reduce intracellular oxidative stress through increased GSH to GSSG ratio. And even if it weren't, what else stimulates insulin? Is it protein? Yeah, it is. And protein doesn't glycate your tissues, does it? Protein is an actual essential macronutrient that you would die without. We are done here, Chris. 15 plus or minus 4.19. Was it a standard error? Or was it a standard deviation just for fun? Because if it's a standard error, oh boy, it's about 3 to 4 times that. I'm assuming standard deviation. I really am, to give grace here. And also just based on what I understand with those numbers. It is not saying whether it is a standard deviation or a standard error. Yeah, standard deviations. Okay, so there's standard deviations. Good, great. At least in this table here. Cool. Hell. Wow. What a paper this is, really, guys. There's a lot of intimidating words on here and numbers and figures. That's why I'm here. Doesn't matter what the p-values are, if there's statistical significance, when the signal-to-noise ratio is still so vast as to be so uninformative to prevent you from making the conclusion that the authors irresponsibly made in the conclusion of the paper and in the abstract. We're done, Chris. Horrible paper. Sugar can actually improve. By the way, this is even worse. Sugar can actually improve insulin sensitivity and decrease oxidative stress. That's not what it said. It actually said insulin. The study used a hyperinsulinemic clamp, which means they introduced insulin into them in a euglycemic situation to see how the glucose responded. Wow, Chris.
That I shouldn't have been listening to. But over the years, as my knowledge, my understanding of scientific literature has vastly improved,
So you think, Chris. So you think. N of 10. That sounds familiar. So do the results provide enough, is that enough statistical power to form a conclusion that would be extrapolated and applicable to the entirety of the population of human beings on this earth, Chris? Learn about standard deviations, learn about means, learn about proper control, learn about sugar versus insulin, by the way. Learn about standard errors as well. You really need to keep your ego in check. This is really problematic, Chris. Wow.
Come to realize that my initial thoughts about sugar being unhealthy were for the most part inaccurate assumptions based largely on...
No, they weren't inaccurate, actually, Chris. Not to mention, by the way, I still have thoughts about that study that he just cited, that absolutely abhorrent study. Even if the insulin pushing the glucose in was what was associated, that was the causal mechanism for a better GSH to whatever the other thing was, I don't care what the ratio was. Better antioxidant status is what they were trying to assess. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that people with diabetes are extremely insulin resistant, okay? Once again, the demographic of people in the study is the only group of people that the results of such study can be applied to. We don't have type 2 diabetes, so would consuming a lot of sugar help us? No. In fact, it might lead to that poor ratio, which is why they could have that poor ratio in the first place. And if you increase insulin enough, well, then you can counteract the pressure on the cells that they're pushing towards insulin with, allowing them to uptake glucose, and maybe anything is better than nothing at all, and therefore you have a better ratio. I mean, there's so many reasons. You cannot use the study to say, oh, you should be consuming sugar. Sugar's really good for you. Ridiculous.
popular opinion and validation of my own beliefs of the time.
You had it right the first time, Chris, and it doesn't mean that you had it right the first time for the right reasons, but you did have your conclusion right the first time.
I'm thankful for the fact that I can admit my failures and open myself.
Okay, so basically what this is a magnanimous sort of sanctimonious approach to trying to aggrandize himself in the perception of ignorant people. That's really what this is. People are going to come to his channel and see, wow, he's so humble, when this is an example of pretentious humility. Okay? You don't talk about how humble you are all the time. Okay? That's not humble. So, anyway.
To new evidence to form an opinion.
You don't know what evidence is. And you also don't know how to interpret real evidence. Even if it slapped you in the face.
Being said, I don't have much at stake for this sugar thing. Think about the people who are...
Well, actually, Chris, if you start talking about sugar being good for you, you will grow a following. Because despite what you said in the beginning, it's not mainstream to get people off sugar, Chris, at all. If people want to make money by promoting health shit, they'd go vegan, Chris. That's how you make money. They'd promote a standard diet, which is basically what the you're doing here. Fat's good, sugar's good. Eat a balanced diet, folks. You think we're stupid, Chris. You really do.
Best-selling books in low-carb diets, paleo, and the evils of sugar. And will they...
There's like no retakes. This is just, in a way, it's sort of admirable, but at the same time, you want to execute it well. It just seems lazy because he didn't put this video together. Someone else did. But anyway, best-selling books, there's best-selling books and there's books that are making a lot of money. Now look at the absolute amount of bestsellers that are making a lot of money in the low-carb ketogenic space and compare it to the ones that are in any other health space. And then compare the absolute amounts of money that those books are raising and compare it to the amount of money that the bestsellers are raising in the other groups.
Be able to actually admit to their readers that what they believe was right might actually have been inaccurate in a manifestation of their own beliefs at the time. Now,
yeah, maybe, and also maybe not, because guess what, Chris? This book that I wrote, the one that you should be reading, the one I keep mentioning here, okay? I don't disagree with anything that I said in this book, still, and it's been years. Now, you could say, of course you won't, because you build the business model on it. Trust me, I operate under a notion that is, whatever the consequences are of telling the truth are the best possible things that can happen to you, no matter where you are in your life. And so trust me, I'd tell the truth. If I were wrong on something, I'd say it. I'd admit to it. I don't care how many people I lose for that in terms of my following. I really don't. Fortunately, I prioritize learning the rudimentary levels of science, and I still am doing that, so as to ensure that the probability of me being extremely wrong on my conclusions is quite low. And I know them to be quite low because the ambiguity in all of my statements, all of my conclusions represent necessarily ambiguity. And I'm very careful. And I say things like, I think, and it's my opinion that. You talk like that, you'll be pretty safe in the space. Let's continue.
People will never admit this at this point because...
Well, I covered that.
Way too much to lose for building a career off of inaccurate assumptions.
Right, but you didn't have anything to lose because when you start promoting sugar, all you have is things to gain because people will flock to you. This is Paul Saladino all over again. You're trying to be magnanimous and it's pretentious as It's illogical as Chris, give me a break.
This is likely one of the reasons it took so long for the saturated fat and dietary cholesterol myths to actually subside.
First of all, they haven't subsided, Chris. That's why I'm here today, doing what I'm doing, saying what I'm saying. But second of all, yes, correct, but it's not the other way around. The sugar industry was the one actually earning profit off of those lies. All right, the mainstream narrative is still the sugar. There are no big saturated fat industries, Chris, that are sitting there perpetuating a lie that glucose is harmful and you shouldn't be consuming it. Okay? There's no major businesses that are overarching and have an unfair influence over smaller businesses, those being like purportedly the sugar industries now or something. It's not the other way around, Chris.
Well, let's not get sidetracked, however. Back to sugar, health, and hormones. So first,
yeah, like you know anything about that, anything about those things at all.
What is sugar?
Well, you've got monosaccharides and you've got disaccharides, Chris. The monosaccharides that are most commonly encountered are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Then you've got the disaccharides, those being sucrose, which is a disaccharide between glucose and fructose, Then you've got lactose, which is a disaccharide between lactose and galactose. And then you've got maltose, which is a disaccharide between glucose and glucose. Then you've got sugar alcohols, like sorbitol, for example, that have an osmotic force and will cause cells to burst upon impact if they do not have an adequate amount of sorbitol dehydrogenase to convert the sorbitol into fructose, which will also damage the cells just in different ways. Look into diabetic retinopathy, neuropathy, and nephropathy, and look into the polyol pathway, and you'll realize why those three conditions are the first to be experienced and the first to develop in diabetes. Okay, it has to do with sorbitol dehydrogenase. Okay.
Naturally occurring carbohydrates that provide energy for the body in the form of glucose and fructose.
Okay, so a few things here. Yes, they're naturally occurring. That doesn't matter. Okay, carbohydrates, yes, we already covered that. Also, that provide energy for the body depends on what you mean by that. If we're going to take that literally, no, they don't. They do not provide energy. They are mass constituents. They are mass units. And what that means is that they're used to create energy, or at least they can be. Because usually what people mean by that, at least this is what I mean, is that it's used by the mitochondria to produce ATP. And in reality, carbohydrates are not used for that. Pyruvate is. Okay? I've covered this on my channel before. Pyruvate is oxidized by the mitochondria to produce ATP. But you're acting as if sugar, that's the only thing that sugar is used for in the body, okay? In reality, because then what you're going to do is you're saying that it provides energy for the body, and then you're going to say, that's why we actually need it. Some cells require glucose for energy, okay? This is an example of failing to understand the human body and the massive system that it really is, okay? The cells that actually require glucose do not use glucose to create energy, really. They don't use it oxidatively at all. Those cells are muscle cells or muscle fibers, astrocytes in the brain, liver cells through glycogenolysis, and erythrocytes through glycolysis. Not glycogenolysis and not oxidative phosphorylation. Glycolysis, an anaerobic or anoxic process. Okay, Chris? What that means is my muscles right now are using glucose, because if not, they wouldn't fire. Glucose is required for my muscle fibers to twitch. I've said this in my channel very many times. Many times. But, Chris, since this guy knows a lot about physiology and biochemistry, at the same time that my muscle fibers are firing, glucose is being used in one part of the cell to cause the muscle fiber to twitch, and in another part of the same cell, they're using fatty acids and ketones to produce energy oxidatively. Chris, they do both and use both at the same time. So yes, muscle fibers do require glucose. Astrocytes in the brain do require glucose. Okay? Liver cells do require glucose for glycogenolysis. Okay? But they're also using fat and ketones, aerobically speaking. Chris, the only cells that don't are erythrocytes, because they don't have mitochondria. The final note that I'll add on this frame is that no, fructose is not used for energy purposes in the body. No, it isn't. Fructose can only be used for energy indirectly by being converted in the liver to glucose. Holy shit. Chris, fructose can be used to create pyruvate for oxidative phosphorylation. Yes. The reason that I said what I said, though, is because it really only occurs in the liver, and also most of it is used to create fat, unless you have really high insulin at that time, and then yes, it could be used to create energy in the liver, fine. Or used to create energy for subsequent ATP formation, because when I say energy, I'm not talking about ATP. The energy is used to create ATP, so to speak. It's fused between the... Anyway.
Your brain, for example, requires roughly 130 grams of glucose on a daily basis to cover the most basic energy needs.
Well, wow. Fantastic. Whoop-de-do. Because there's a process, Chris, that I'm sure you'll be talking about very soon, called gluconeogenesis, okay? You should check out the video, viewers, and also Chris, if you're watching, you should check out the video that I did a few months ago about the ADA's 2005 paper, where they admit openly in the paper that carbohydrates are not required for human consumption. And when they were actually determining or establishing the RDA for carbohydrates, that is in the hundreds of grams, they literally said it wasn't because you actually had to consume glucose for the brain's glucose requirements. They just said some people have a problem. One or two people may have problems because of health conditions with them being able to produce sufficient glucose for their brain function through the liver. So instead, we're just going to make the requirement double the amount that type of person would have to take or consume to subserve those energy needs. So they actually doubled the requirement that a person that is not representative of the overall population may need to subserve glucose functionality or brain functionality through glucose supply. It was really f***ing bad. I'll link the study in the top right corner of the screen. Really f***ing bad. So anyway, Chris, gluconeogenesis, not to mention that the majority of the brain actually does not require glucose. The majority of the brain is made up of neurons, Chris, which can use ketones or glucose. They never need glucose at any point in their lifetime. The cells in the brain that require glucose make up the minority of the brain. Those are astrocytes through glycogenolysis. Chris f***ing what? Walker.
The major internal organs, glands, and muscles all use glucose as their main energy source.
So, misleading. Just talked about this. Muscle fibers do require glucose for muscle firing, for twitching. Basically, if anyone wants a crash course on this, a muscle fiber is a very large cell. They're one of the largest cells in the body. In fact, depending on your criteria, they are the largest cells. Neurons are just the longest. Muscle fibers have a sarcoplasm instead of a cytoplasm. A cell fluid, basically. The cytoplasm and the cytosol are not the same thing, but we'll use them interchangeably here, I guess. You can get away with that? Okay. They have a sarcoplasm, not a cytoplasm. But anyway, that doesn't really matter. In the cell fluid, you have glycogen. Okay? When a muscle fiber needs to be fired and needs to contract, like I'm doing right now, what happens is the glycogen is broken down via a process called glycogenolysis, which yields ATP at a higher amount than glycolysis does, because glycolysis requires one more ATP to power the process, actually, if people didn't understand that. It requires more ATP, it expends more ATP to use glycolysis than glycogenolysis does. That is why muscle fibers use glycogenolysis in the first place. You yield more ATP that way. The ATP is hydrolyzed at the myofilaments, causing the muscle fibers to contract. A byproduct of this reaction is pyruvate, which usually is so much more than the mitochondria can oxidize at that time, causing most of the pyruvate to have a negative effect on the pH of the cell. In order to counteract this effect, the body converts the pyruvate into lactate, also known as lactic acid. This is where this stuff is coming from. This is why we produce lactate during exercise. Lactate is then exported, moves to the liver to be converted back into glucose, and the cycle continues. That's called the Cori cycle. In order to replenish glycogen, the body requires ATP. Where does that ATP come from? The mitochondria. So yes, in another part of the cell, the mitochondria are still doing what they're doing. They are producing energy in the form of chemical potential energy, which is then used by ADP and PI, or really by the mitochondria, to synthesize ADP and PI together to form ATP. However, we need something to transfer the energy from the mitochondria to the sarcoplasm. That is where creatine comes in. Yes, why do you think creatine is a brain enhancer? Astrocytes use glycogenolysis, and a performance enhancer. Muscles use glycogenolysis. Creatine comes over with inorganic phosphate, takes that potential energy from the mitochondria, basically steals it, fuses together, forms PCR, phosphocreatine. You may have heard that before. Moves all the way back to the sarcoplasm, unloads that energy, reforming PCR into PI and CR, creatine. The energy is used by an ADP molecule and another inorganic phosphate molecule to fuse and form ATP, which is exclusively used to synthesize more glycogen for the next muscle twitch. In other words, muscles use both at the same damn time. Muscles use both glucose and fatty acids and ketones, anything that can be oxidized in the mitochondria, at the same time. Why did I give that entire spiel there? Because Chris here is trying to imply that, well, your muscles require glucose, so you should be consuming it. Why would you deprive your body of the glucose? Which, first of all, even on its face, doesn't make sense, even if his logic and his implications, rather, were correct, because gluconeogenesis still exists.
Deprive your body from this, it will try to make up for it by a process called
No, it won't try to make up for it. It will make up for it. And it will thank you, in fact.
gluconeogenesis, which in the body, it breaks down protein and fatty acids to
So it breaks down protein and fatty acids into what?
create glucose. If you do this long,
Yeah, to create glucose. Okay, so here's another problem here. What you're going to say here is, well, your body will break down your muscles to create glucose because that's where it gets amino acids from. First of all, no, because if you eat enough protein, that's not true, okay? Second of all, the most important point here, your body very rarely uses fatty acids to create glucose in the liver. It can only use odd-chain fatty acids, not even-chain fatty acids, like palmitic acid, for example, which is 16 carbons. You can have a 15 carbon chain, a 17 carbon chain, a 11 carbon chain. Those can be used to create glucose, but that very seldom occurs. You're missing a major glucose precursor or non-glucose precursor that's used to create glucose. Chris, you know what that is? It's the primary one that's used. There's a reason he's leaving it out. It's the primary one used in a fasted state, in a ketogenic state, in a carnivore diet. It's glycerol from fat cells. For people that don't know, triglycerides are what's stored in your fat cells. That's what we think of as stored fat. But whenever they're utilized, whenever your body taps into those stores, they're broken apart into their individual constituents. So think triglyceride, a glycerol molecule with 3 fatty acids attached. They're broken up into glycerol and fatty acids. The fatty acids can be used for energy production. Glycerol is used for glucose production in the liver. Not to mention that 75%, it seems, of all fat that is used to create glucose, so all glycerol really, is recycled, meaning that it converts back into triglycerides, thus to be stored again. Our body is very efficient, Chris. We use our own stored fat for glucose production, okay? So to speak. It's glycerol.
Enough, and your body goes into ketosis, which surely has some benefits in terms of fast.
God, get your shit together, Chris. This is a video. You are publishing this to the public. Get your shit together, okay? With the stuttering, it'd be one thing if you're going off the cuff. I'm pretty sure you're reading off of a script or something. Anyway, forget the benefits of ketosis. Let's think of it this way. Instead of thinking of it in terms of benefits and cons and pros and cons, think of it in terms of indication level. What are our genes most familiar with being in and withstanding? An anabolic metabolism, a chronically anabolic metabolism, or a continuous catabolic metabolism? Well, it's the latter, Chris. For 4.5 million years, we've existed primarily in a catabolic metabolism, which means ketosis, which means gluconeogenesis, which means glycogenolysis. Chris, this is ridiculous.
It's also just another form of metabolic stress.
No, it isn't. Well, yes, it is, because your heart beating is an example of metabolic stress, Chris. What your implications are is false, which is that it's really what he's meaning to say is distress. It is not distressing. You have no evidence of that. Continue.
Is designed to
what?
Occur during the glucose deprivation.
Designed to occur during the glucose deprivation. Distress is. Really? Wow. Sorry, but I'm not feeling these distressing ramifications.
Almost all carbohydrates, starches, and sugars break down to glucose. The simplest
all of them do, except fiber. Wow!
Of sugar after ingestion. The rate at which this happens is measured by the glycemic index or the glycemic...
Oh my Chris! The glycemic index? For people that are unaware of what the glycemic index is, let me just give a brief rundown. There is a scale called the glycemic scale. They call it an index, and basically what it's supposed to do, its designed use and utility is to measure the degree to which a food will raise your blood sugar in relation to glucose, or depending on the study, white bread. So what they do is 0 is nothing, you've consumed nothing, no glucose at all, and 100 is glucose, or again, depending on the study, white bread. So whatever level a blood glucose reading is seen attaining in someone after consuming white bread, again, depending on the study, or glucose, that's considered 100. So if you have a glycemic index, if a food has a glycemic index of 80, well, then it raises your blood glucose 80% of the way that glucose or white bread does. Okay. Some of you may already see the problem with this because there's about 1,000. If you've read my book, again, I'm going to keep plugging it because of people like Chris here, because he's just showing me why it's still so necessary, and it always will be. So if you read my book, if you watch my channel long enough, you understand why this is an issue, okay? But for people that don't know, let me just give you a few reasons. Number one, if you tried to see how much glucose raised your blood sugar, straight glucose, you consume it every single day, the level would not be the same because it depends on the time of day, your exercise activity and style that day, the amount of time that's transpired since you exercised, if you did at all, and you consuming the glucose, the amount of sleep you got the night prior, whether you're menstruating or not as a female, etc., etc. That's in one person. Now try and imagine establishing that level for multiple people in a population. Then imagine extrapolating that to the entire population of a nation or the world. Amazing, huh? Every single person's different. They are genotypically and phenotypically different. What does that mean? If someone consumes carbohydrates as their primary energy source, so to speak, their ability to metabolize glucose, aerobically speaking, so to speak, again, is going to be more efficient than me that doesn't consume glucose at all. So the levels that they will rise to and the length of time that they will stay elevated, that's going to be different, isn't it? That's just phenotypic differences. What about genotypic differences? Our entire genomes are different compared to each other. Could that possibly have an influence on the rate at which glucose will rise and fall? And not only the rate, but the level that it attains? Yes. Now the kicker here is that the samples that they actually use to determine GIs, the glycemic indices for certain foods, they're less than 10 people. And what that means is that the signal to noise ratio is so uninformative that the noise actually outweighs the signal. So for example, if they say that a food has a glycemic index of 50, sometimes that can be plus or minus 55. It's really, really bad. So, glycemic index, he says it's measured by that. No, it isn't, Chris. No, it isn't. It's a load of shit. And again, you do not understand statistical inference. So it makes sense why you'd make a video like this and say things like this.
Load. Although low carbers tried for years to confuse average people into believing that low glycemic index would be it for weight loss.
First of all, that's not what people, maybe some people, okay? And again, this is the problem with saying keto, because what do you mean by keto? Do you mean carnivore? Because I don't really hear anyone in the carnivore space talking about GI foods, low GI, high GI, medium GI foods. I hear no one in the space talking about that at all. What we talk about is insulin and carbohydrates themselves, irrespective of GI level.
Research showed time and again that it was...
Research showed, everyone. Chris here is telling us what research showed, as if it ever really shows anything at all. Holy shit, Chris. Research showed. Show the study.
Total energy intake of calories, not...
Okay, so here you go. Here's your problem. You don't consume calories. You don't yield calories from your food. You don't even yield energy from your food effectively. The calories released from our bodies allow us to warm ourselves up because it creates body heat. And guess what? When we lose those calories, or they are released from us, how does that affect the mass balance of the body, considering that calories have no mass, Chris? Zero. None. They don't do anything to our mass. Okay? Energy and mass are different units. So before people want to say, well, Eddie, that was just pedantic and captious, because really what he's talking about is food intake. And in other words, mass intake. They're not interchangeable. On a mathematical level, they are interconvertible, but not on a day-to-day basis. What does that mean? Let's use a practical example. Paul Saladino says his diet is animal-based, despite the fact that 80% of the diet is composed of fruit and honey. Why do you think that is? Is it because he's being dishonest? Yes, but he's really just ignorant, actually. He's dishonest with many other things, but he's just ignorant. In reality, the reason that he uses to justify his use of the word animal-based to refer to his diet is because in terms of caloric value, since the animal foods are so calorically dense, he actually derives the majority of his calories from animal foods. So it is still animal-based. This is what happens when you believe that the body uses calories for metabolic processes. This is what happens when you fail to understand that we are a biochemical machine and not a steam engine or a bomb calorimeter. I've done a video on this, by the way. And it was of me reviewing a paper in Cell magazine, an atrocious paper, talking about these people having an energy intake that was controlled, which, by the way, wasn't even measured with kilocalories. It was measured with kilojoules. Wow. And what happened was they did control for kilojoules for energy intake, but the mass was all over the place. So they didn't eat the same amount of food at all.
Index that is behind our ability to gain or lose.
Science says calories in, calories out always. Wow. Holy shit, Chris. Holy shit. This is bad. Pathetic, Chris. Calories in, calories out is not how things work because calories don't have mass. Oh my God. The first law of thermodynamics, which actually lays this out, is only applicable to closed thermodynamic system, evinced by the fact that there is an explicit exclusion of mass from the equation. The human body is an open thermodynamic system, Chris, which means we not only allow for the flow of energy in and out of the body, we also have a flow of mass in and out of the body as well. Okay, Chris? The human body absorbs mass in the forms of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and alcohol, chemically interacts those substances under control of molecular oxygen. They react in such a way so as to change the positioning of the chemical bonds, and since those chemical reactions are exothermic, some heat or calories are released. Much of it is actually to entropy, the vast majority of which is to entropy, and the remainder of which is encapsulated with ADP and PI to form ATP, the molecular energy storage form, or the cellular energy currency of the body, which is still mass, by the way. This is f***ing ridiculous. Chris, get the f*** out of here. It's not calories in, calories out. And I can show you 5 different studies on the screen that prove that the energy balance model of obesity, the whole paradigm, is a completely fallacious and erroneous paradigm. And it's inconsistent. That's a better word to use. It's mass in, mass out. And it's all about hormones, because hormones actually have an influence over mass. They do not over calories.
Fat. Now, the most common kinds of sugar in our diet include glucose, which is the simplest form of sugar and the main energy provider in the cells in the body.
No, it's not the main energy provider of the cells. False. That depends on what diet you are consuming. You are lying to your viewers. You are misleading your viewers. Chris, that's not true. We covered glucose's role in the body. Most of my cells, Chris, are using fatty acids and ketone bodies for fuel. My entire liver is using fat, which is why I'm producing ketones in the first place. Learn ketogenesis. Learn how that works.
The blood sugar in your veins is also glucose. There's fructose.
Yes, blood glucose, correct. But it doesn't mean that there aren't others after you consume f***ing fructose. Chris, get the f*** out of here.
There's fructose, which is found naturally in fruits and honey.
So f***ing what?
Sweeter than glucose and is
Yes.
metabolized in the liver instead of in the gut.
Well, no. What the f*** is this guy saying? Anyone on the internet can say f***ing anything today. The small intestine does use fructose, Chris. It's just to a small degree before it enters the bloodstream and is then metabolized by the liver, either through the creation of glucose or the production of fat, effectively. Holy shit.
Now there's sucrose, which is table sugar. It's about 50% fructose and 50% glucose.
It's not about 50% of those. It is chemically. It has to be.
You can get it extracted from beets or sugarcane. Sucrose occurs naturally in...
So what? Chris, it doesn't matter. There are lots of things that occur naturally that you should not be consuming.
Vegetables and fruits. And then there's lactose, which is milk sugar. It's found in milk and dairy products naturally.
Yes, and most people, it seems, have an intolerance to it.
There's also maltose, which is found in malted drinks.
We already covered all this, didn't we, Chris? I covered it before you even got to it, because I actually know what the I'm talking about.
Here. Now, the studies looking into the effects of sugar on various health parameters often
did not look at the effects, because effect is the conjugate of cause, and you cannot inform upon cause and effect relationships in the area of inferential statistics, which is what human nutrition science employs. Chris, this is absolutely unassailable. You can't get around this. They've looked at associations between sugar intake, as reported usually, if it's a prospective cohort study, or in a randomized control trial with people that are not genotypically nor phenotypically identical for a short period of time.
Use pure fructose, pure glucose, or sucrose. In our normal daily lives, the majority of the sugars we consume come in a balance of about 50% glucose and
who the cares? Wouldn't that make it worse?
percent fructose. The main difference between glucose and fructose is the fact that the latter is metabolized in the liver, and
also it's far more glycating than glucose is, Chris. And it's also not detectable on an HbA1c test directly. There are many differences between glucose and fructose, okay? The main one, in my opinion, is that it's more harmful.
Rapidly absorbed. So there's some...
Who cares? So is glucose.
Actually, some real health benefits of sugar.
Oh my... Wow. What you're going to start doing is citing a bunch of studies that have the inability to report on benefits that anything can confer upon anyone, because benefit requires a causal inference to be made.
Due to the demonization of sugar, it might seem a bit crazy to claim that sugar consumption would actually have health benefits.
Well, it seems crazy to inane idiots like yourself, Chris, that simply sit in front of a camera, have someone else make this little edit for you and put a background track in while you read a script and stumble over your words, and then get paid tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. I'm telling you, you start a business like this, it becomes really easy to make money. It does. So you better make sure that what you're doing and what you're promoting and what you're saying is true and beneficial and grounded in truth.
It does definitely seem that way. However, there's evidence to the contrary. So why?
No, there isn't. There's not evidence in the area of human nutrition science to support any diet, Chris. Any behavior, none.
Source of energy that the body naturally prioritizes be harmful for us.
It doesn't naturally prioritize it, Chris. Have you ever heard of physiological insulin resistance, which is where the body doesn't metabolize glucose as effectively in terms of aerobic oxidation as it does if you are consuming glucose all the time? It happens whenever you are in a ketogenic state for long periods of time. I probably have it. Physiological insulin resistance. There you go. What are you talking about?
Why would the most easily attainable naturally occurring foods like berries or fruit, which are loaded...
Those are easily attainable, Chris? So if I threw you out in the wild right now, you'd be able to easily attain those things? Not an animal or anything? Not meat, which is protein and fat? That's like saying Twinkies. Like, why would... You shouldn't be eating Twinkies. That's just dogma, isn't it? Because why would the most easily attainable, one of the most easily attainable foods... Dude, we live in an industrial world. Everything's easily attainable. If I throw you back in evolutionarily consistent conditions, are those really easily attainable? Really? What are you talking about, Chris?
Simple sugars be the cause of our ever-increasing weight and health problems. And lastly, why would...
Guys, I'm done. I'm sorry. We got a little over halfway through this video. He didn't even talk about how sugar is apparently, supposedly, an antioxidant. That's funny. That's really funny. Because glucose damages your cells, which can induce inflammation. It does induce inflammation, which lowers redox status, thus, if anything, raising your propensity to produce reactive oxidation species, or oxygen species. Wow. This is how I feel after all these videos, man. This one was different. This one was worse than usual. Christopher Walker is making tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a month promoting this nonsense. So the least that you could do is subscribe to my channel, like the video, and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And also buy this book, Contraindicated, a closer look and revision of mainstream health axioms that have perpetuated illness, disorder, disease for over a century. If you have not bought the book already, the second edition, once again, is out. Link to that, or links to every single format, in the description below. You can also support me through Patreon if you feel like earning 1 week early uploads, ad-free content, uncensored content, and an exclusive Discord server for mingling and confabulation with the rest of my exclusive fans. And you can also, finally, refer to the link on the bottom of the screen. What is that link? Well, that is a link that will bring you to an amazing site with amazing products from an amazing brand known as Cerule. If you purchase product through that link, you will get a permanent percentage discount and permanent free shipping when signing up for monthly deliveries. That is the caveat. But of course, I would not recommend buying a product if you don't actually know what they are in the first place. So fortunately for you, I have linked in the top right corner of the screen a Cerule Products video, which is a complete elucidation and explanation of what those products are, who should take them, why you should take them, when to take them, etc., etc. And also, I would further migrate to the description below to find a video between myself and Professor Mark K on these products in further detail, as well as the company of Cerule itself, which I think is incredibly important if you are willing to purchase product through said link. So, with that being said, join me next time when we react to more absolute pseudoscientific, trite, hackneyed, f***ing health erroneousness. So, till then.